Okay, so this is the continuation of our study that we've called leadership or discipleship as a model for leadership development. This is module 3 that started with our denomination's disciple making the Jesus way and continued on with discipleship the Jesus way, and now discipleship as a model for leadership development. And anyway, this is, if you've been with us this whole time, this is week 8 of 9. So we're getting down towards the finish. This is module 3, session 2. The first section says read 1 Corinthians 11:1, which is a short passage, so that makes it really easy. It says, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." So, number one, I've entitled this the model. Paul calls the recipients of his letter to follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. So I think we kind of made a shift in the last session from focusing primarily on Jesus to starting to look at Paul and really starting to look at Barnabas and what Barnabas did in helping to raise up Paul and the 2 by 2. And then we moved on to realize that now Barnabas and Paul split and went out separately with John Mark with Barnabas and Silas with Paul, and then Paul quickly picked up Timothy. And so we're starting to see how the model that Jesus put forward, just in case you were a little skeptical about whether the Bible really teaches that we should do things the Jesus way. We've been talking about discipleship the Jesus way, and that's a pretty good model. We started out in the first training saying, shouldn't we pay attention to Jesus's methods and not just his message? And If we have really good methods that are working, then I'm not convinced that we have to do everything exactly like is done historically in every way. The Church of the Nazarene has a polity that is, we don't necessarily declare is from the Bible, but rather we believe God's given us wisdom in our polity to do things in a way that works. It's not against the Bible, but we don't necessarily go in and say how should we govern the church and study and make sure that we cite the Bible. Some denominations do. Congregationalists tend to be that way, or Episcopals tend to be that way and feel like they are tracing their methods from the Bible. But we don't always tend to do that. We think God gives us wisdom in the how of things sometimes, but it's hard to argue if what we're doing is not working effectively. And let me just say that something has changed not only in the church in North America, but in specifically the Church of the Nazarene, that would suggest that what we're doing is not really working. And on the flip side, to be a little more encouraging, so in other words, the church is declining in North America. So what we've been doing has not been working. Now that said, I think I just heard today that the USA Canada Church of the Nazarene is about to report, or we're on track for this year to report a second straight year of growth instead of decline, that is in itself of itself a miracle. And let me just say that one of the reasons that we're seeing growth instead of decline is because we've been doing a lot of training and teaching about getting back to our roots and doing things this way in discipleship. And that shift, starting conversations with people that we don't know, and and transitioning to talk about spiritual things and really engaging churches and Christians within our denomination in the USA, Canada um, to, to do discipleship the Jesus way. And so that shift or that push back to something that we used to do when we were seeing growth has, I believe, spurred on growth for the last couple of years. So, um, in my own personal experience, I have seen times in the church where we've done really well and times in the church where we have struggled, even as a church that tends to be, on average, more successful at reaching people and raising them up than most. But I've seen ebbs and flows in our successful growth, and they are almost always tied to how well we are discipling and particularly using the model of Jesus. So yeah, so we shifted in the last session to really start talking about how Barnabas and then Paul really implemented Jesus's methods in the early church. So one of the coolest things is when we have the opportunity to not just see how Jesus did something, but then how the early church interpreted what Jesus did and made it work for their setting and their situation, because it says something to us about how we might be able to interpret Jesus's methods and apply them to our setting as well. Um, so Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthians, and he encouraged them to follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. So we're going to be focusing much more in this session and the next on what it looked like for Paul to implement Jesus's discipleship methods in the early church. So number 2 says God's plan for the Christian life and for Christian leadership is passed down from discipler to disciple. So the blank is disciple. So we see then that what Barnabas had apparently learned from the early church leaders who were direct disciples of Jesus. Um, he then used to raise up Paul, and then Paul now uses it to raise up others. And so we are seeing this plan sort of passed down from generation to generation in the church, because as I disciple someone, then this is how they know how to do it. So then they disciple others in the same method. So that's the information that we got. We're starting with a very short thing where Paul is saying, "Follow me as I follow my example as I follow the example of Christ," and this passing down of not only Christ's message but also his methods from discipler to disciple. Discussion groups. Discuss in your groups. We spent 2 full modules, 6 sessions, specifically talking about Jesus. Now we're talking about Paul. Is this still discipleship the Jesus way? And I would argue yes. This is a good discussion for us to have, though. I would argue yes, because Paul is beginning to model. And we'll start to see if you say, well, yeah, Jesus sent them out 2 by 2, but Jesus had more than 2 that followed him. Well, let's start to watch Paul as we go. How do we know? Well, we can see the markers. First of all, 2 by 2 was something that Jesus told them, and they were doing that. But also, Jesus had 12 that were following. And we start to see, as we study the book of Acts further, we start to see Paul, as he travels, sort of gain followers who begin to travel with him. This sounds very Jesus-like. And then he will send them out, or in some cases leave them behind, to continue the work that he was doing, and then he'll meet back up with them. So this is sort of an introduction to what we're about to be looking at in the next few texts in Acts. But basically what we're seeing is Paul continuing on a very Jesus like model in his discipleship of others. If we use this model, we need to remember that our example is only as good as our connection with Jesus and his example. Are we ready to say what Paul said to others? So, in other words, if this is supposed to be passed down, then we are the ones who have been discipled and now are to be passing it down, and we should be telling others, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. But in order to be able to say that, we have to be following the example of Christ. And now I'm talking not just in methods, but even more so in our consistency of relationship. And we can go to what Jesus taught, like, I am the vine, you are the branches. Remain in me. Um, that if we don't remain in Christ, if we don't stay connected to Christ, and honestly, not just his example, but his empowerment, his direction, his spirit and wisdom and revelation, if we don't stay connected to Christ, we don't have anything to teach others. Maybe on the flip side of that, if we don't feel like we know enough to disciple, it's also true that all we need to know is what we get from our connection with Christ. So we don't have to be experts. We don't have to have theological educations. We need to be connected with Christ. Um, I think the early disciples, um, the religious leaders took note that they were untrained, ordinary men, but that they had been with Christ. And that's what we really need. The next section says, read Acts 16:13 through 15 and 38 through 40. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. And then we jump down, 38. The officers, now they've been put in prison because there was a girl following them around and um, telling fortunes, I guess, and shouting behind them. So they got arrested because they cast out a demon. The officers reported this to the magistrates, and when they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens, they were alarmed. They came to appease them and escorted them out from the prison, requesting them to leave the city. After Paul and Silas came out of the prison, they went to Lydia's house. This is the important part, where they met with the brothers and sisters and encouraged them. Then they left. So they were ordered to leave the city, but before they left, they went to Lydia's house to encourage the brothers and sisters. So, number 3 says, Paul and his companions followed the practice of Jesus that we learned in the first module, disciple making the Jesus way. So, that kind of answers the question in our discussion before. Number 4, Lydia was a worshiper of God, but that doesn't mean that she knew Jesus. So, Lydia is kind of an interesting story. Lydia was apparently a merchant, a businesswoman, which likely meant in her day and age that she hung with wealthy people and she was wealthy. She was from Thyatira. Thyatira was the source of this special purple dye, which she was using to dye cloth, probably importing herself and dyeing the cloth, and then selling the purple cloth. Purple was a sign of wealth and royalty, so she was selling it to people Uh, she was selling something rare and imported that she had special access to people who were wealthy and important. So she was probably a business person that had done very well and became relatively wealthy and important herself. All that said, there's no mention of her husband, which is quite abnormal if she had one. The fact that she is a business person and raising her own income suggests that she probably did not have one. We don't know why. There's a lot of possibilities. She could have been a widow, although it doesn't call her one specifically. She could have never been married, but she had a household. Was that her servants? Was that children? Was she? We don't know. All of these are sort of speculation. Um, but she was a believer of God in God. Now, to be a believer in God does not mean that you know Jesus. It could mean a lot of things, but probably there was no synagogue in this place. So probably Paul had went to try to find a place where they were. It says they found a place of prayer. It was probably a Jewish place of prayer that was somewhat makeshift because there was no synagogue in this area because it was a Gentile area, and maybe not enough Jews to support a synagogue. But nonetheless, Jewish expansion had. This was not a Jew by birth, but she was somebody who had come to believe in God and pray. But it doesn't really tell us like to what extent, how much she knew about what she was doing, um, and that sort of thing. And so number 5 says, when Lydia had been baptized, she invited them to her home. And that's good. Invited them to her home. Number 6, when Paul and Silas were released from prison, they went to Lydia's house and met with the brothers and sisters to encourage them. Okay, discuss in groups. How does Paul's interactions with Lydia in verse 13 remind you of Jesus and the Samaritan woman from John 4? So, Paul went to a place where people gathered, which would have been, I mean, they were gathered for prayer, so that's maybe a little bit. I think it also says, how does it differ? Maybe it was different because the expectation was to find people there who were praying or who already believed in God. But the similarity is he came and sat down and started talking to people. Mostly it sounds like there were women there and not men. It says that they talked to the women who gathered there, which actually sounds eerily similar to the awkward situation Jesus found himself in when he was alone with the Samaritan woman. Um, and they began a conversation with people they didn't know, and they began talking about spiritual things. So maybe those people were already inclined towards talking about spiritual things because they were at a place of prayer. That may be the difference. But nonetheless, we see a similarity to Jesus's model and method here, that we learned in the first training. Next, it says, do we know people who believe in God but do not really know Jesus? And I would say I meet a lot of people who believe in God, maybe even believe in Jesus, but don't know Jesus. So, I met a family, a couple, on Monday, who consider themselves Christians, but they haven't been to church in years because somebody, as a chaplain, as a hospice chaplain, because she is nearing death. She's got questions. She wants them answered from a Christian perspective because she considers herself Christian. Her husband even reported getting out his old dusty Bible that he hasn't read in years to open it up and show her the answers to some of her questions. He's not somebody who has kept up with what Jesus might be saying to him regularly, but he still knows where to go to find the answers. Um, So this would be somebody that I would say believes in God, even believes in Jesus, but doesn't necessarily know and follow Jesus. And the reason this is important is because I think sometimes when somebody says, "Well, I'm a Christian," we just kind of leave it at that, and we say, "Well, I don't need to evangelize them, or I don't need to disciple because they already said they're a Christian." Or if somebody says, "Yeah, I believe in God," and they let you pray for them, we think, "Oh, well, I don't really need to disciple them; they already know God." Well, um, Paul and his companions came in touch with Lydia. She already knew about God, but she needed discipled and she needed led to Christ. So they led her to Christ, and then she said, "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," in other words, now, after they led her to Christ, she said, "Well, if you consider me a disciple, come to my home." So the second part says, should we assume that everyone who says they believe in God knows Jesus? I would say no. Is it making a disciple to teach someone who believes in God what it means to follow Jesus? Yes. Yes. If somebody doesn't know Jesus, if somebody even says they believe in Jesus, I think sometimes we're like, oh, well, that doesn't count because they didn't. In America, historically, we've had such a high percentage of people that claimed Christianity despite not really serving Jesus. That I think that's kind of where we fell asleep, and we didn't. We just assumed everybody was Christian and didn't really think much about making disciples. But if we had discipled those who claimed Christianity, perhaps we would have a more Christian society, a group of people who better understand. In fact, I would say that in our churches, we may find that like half of our churches are believers in Jesus, but have never been discipled and don't really know what it means to follow Jesus and live for Jesus. And so I would say, like, that may be the first step. I mean, I love the idea of going out and talking to somebody who's historically Muslim or Buddhist or whatever else and talking to them about faith in Jesus Christ. But the honest truth is, Paul spent, like, he always went first to the people who said they believed in God but were not really following Jesus. And then once he had won them over, then he started working on or if they had denied him and pushed him away, then he started working on the people that didn't know about God at all. um, and I think that was just some wisdom in that it um, it got the low hanging fruit first. The people that were not antagonistic towards God, let's get them on our team. Let's get them helping us with discipleship. Now, I've told plenty of people that at some point it feels like it'd be easier to go out and find people that were completely lost because they don't have so many bad understandings of God. But anyway, and I would argue that when Jesus said that his primary mission was to the lost sheep of Israel, that what Paul is doing is the same thing that Jesus did. He came first to the people of Israel because if he could get them on the team, then they become the priests of the world. They become the people that connect other people, non-Jews, with God. Um, how does Lydia's invitation for them to come to her home compare with Jesus's trip to Matthew's home? I guess there's some differences in that at that point, she was a believer of God. They baptized her whole household, but Matthew followed Jesus. And so it seems like Lydia decided to follow Jesus, and then she invited them back to her home with her household, with her people, where people would come that she knows. And it may have started out very much like this invitation from Matthew to go to his home. And so we're sort of reaffirming. It says, does this reaffirm the pattern of discipleship we have been learning? And I would say yes. What seems to have happened in the time that they were staying in Lydia's house, based on what we learn in verse 40. So in verse 40, they go back to Lydia's house to encourage the brothers and sisters. So apparently, other people have come to know Jesus in the time that they were there. So that they had basically a whole church meeting at her house that they needed to go encourage before they left town. The next thing says, what do you think happened when they left? Did anybody come to know Jesus after Paul and Silas left? Or did the church just continue to meet with anyone else without anyone else coming to follow Jesus? So it doesn't tell us, but let's just think about it logically, reasonably. Let's consider. So Paul and Silas left. They generally left, and we're going to see this sort of pattern. They generally left with somebody who was mature enough in their faith to oversee the believers and sort of keep them growing. Now, they also wrote letters and things like that after they left, but that's the general process that we are going to see, if we haven't seen yet, is that when Paul goes to a town, he leads people to Christ, he establishes a church, and that church may have leaders. Now, those leaders may be pretty young in the faith, so they need to be continually encouraged and things like that, but the assumption is the church continues on and that they begin doing the things that Paul was doing, which includes discipling others, leading others to Jesus. Um, Now we're going to see that a little bit more, I think, in the next text. So if you don't believe that that's what happened, that's fine. If you don't believe that happened in this text, maybe they didn't. Maybe they just babysat all the people that Paul had already won, and they didn't continue to lead people closer to Christ. But that does not seem to be the pattern. And so I submit that as, if that wasn't the pattern for them, why has that become the pattern for our churches? Where the pastor or some evangelist basically leads people to Christ, and then the rest of the church just kind of meets and exists without discipling, without leading more people to Jesus. So the third part of this says, read Acts 18, 1 through 4, and 18 through 28. So the text says, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Verse 18. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchreae because of a vow he had taken. They arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. He himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And they asked him to spend more time with them. When let's see, when they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined. But as he left, he promised, I will come back if it is God's will. Then he set sail from Ephesus. Then he landed at Caesarea. When he landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from there and traveled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. When Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome them. When he arrived, he was great help to those who by grace had believed, for he vigorously refuted his Jewish opponents in public debate, proving that from the scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. Okay, number 7. Paul met Aquila and his wife Priscilla in Corinth because they had been ordered to leave Rome. Yes. Number 8. They worked together as tent makers while Paul continued to speak in the synagogue. Yes. Number 9. Paul took Priscilla and Aquila with him to Ephesus, where he left Priscilla and Aquila. I just want to affirm Priscilla is listed first everywhere we see it, except for the moment that he met Aquila and his wife. So everywhere else we see Priscilla listed first. Now that was a big deal to us when we were studying Barnabas and Saul. And it was always Barnabas and Saul until it became Paul and Silas. And what we learn is the person is usually listed first who is more mature or has more spiritual authority if there's a pairing. So what we have here is Priscilla being listed before her husband every time. And I think that's important. It's kind of an undercurrent in this study, I think, that we talked about Lydia. Now we're talking about Priscilla and Aquila. The Church of the Nazarene does ordain women and believe in women being called to pastoral ministry and leadership within the church. And one of the reasons that we believe that is because the biggest counterpoint to our belief system about women in ministry is people who say Paul said specifically in a couple of his letters, I do not let women speak in church. But how do we process the fact that Paul specifically, first of all, Paul brought Priscilla and Aquila into the ministry, and seemed to give Priscilla authority over Aquila in this situation, or at least primacy. And how do we deal with how they spoke to the women down by the river and then went to Lydia's house? It almost feels like when she said, if you consider me a believer in the Lord, she was asking, does the fact that I'm a woman, I'm a merchant, I'm prominent, does the fact that I'm a woman make it so that you won't let me lead? And it almost I don't know that this is, I've never heard anybody else say this, but Paul and Silas going to the home of Lydia feels very much to me like when Peter went to the home of Cornelius. Like this is this affirmation that God can use Lydia, just like there was an affirmation in Peter going there, don't call unclean what I've called clean. So I've not heard other people say that, but it's what it feels like to me. Um, so so Paul seems to be the leading example of those who trusted women in ministry, and yet he's often cited as the leading person that says don't use women in ministry because of those letters. And in context, those letters are specifically referring to, I believe, a specific place and time for a specific reason. Number 10, Apollos arrived in Ephesus to teach about Jesus from the scriptures accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. Priscilla and Aquila invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. That's all right. So discuss in your groups. We are told that Paul met Aquila and his wife, but for the rest of the text, his wife is mentioned before him. Why do you think that is? We've already kind of talked about that a little bit. What else do you think has happened while Paul was working with them as tent makers? Were they only working, or was their conversation happening as well? And I would argue that discipleship was happening as they worked alongside one another. That Paul was teaching them and raising them up as leaders in the church, even as they worked together in business. Why do you think Paul left Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus after taking them with him from Corinth? So it seems to me like he left them behind as leaders and disciplers in the church there. Because this was his pattern. Just as Jesus sent people ahead of him to the towns that he was going to go to, and then he sort of joined them. Paul had this tendency to go take people with him and then leave them behind and then come back and write letters to them as well and sort of process the ministry that they were doing. So if he was discipling them as he was working alongside them, and they got to the place where he could trust them to oversee the church, then he went on and left them there because they could be trusted to keep the church on track. Specifically, Priscilla and Aquila, I'm just going to say. And then it says, what do we make of the interaction they had with Apollos? Where did Apollos go after he left Ephesus? So they were apparently very trustworthy because they were there, and Apollos came to town, and he was teaching, and they were like, he understands that Jesus is the Messiah and is teaching it from the Old Testament. But he's missing something. He was missing the baptism of the Holy Spirit. He primarily had the baptism of John, which was for repentance. So he had repented and he had turned to Jesus, but he was missing something, because that was all to prepare the way for Jesus's arrival. So when Jesus came, and then when Jesus died, rose again, ascended into heaven, the Holy Spirit came. That was the part that Apollos was missing. And Priscilla and Aquila invited him to their home, discipleship, to explain to him the ways of God more adequately. When it came time that he wanted to go to Achaia, which, by the way, Paul had left Corinth to go to Ephesus, and then he had moved on, and he promised to come back to Corinth. Corinth is in Achaia. So now Apollos is going to Achaia, and they send letters affirming him as a minister. So they basically ordained him, said, hey, listen to what this guy has to say. He's on the right track. And they sent him back to a place where they had already done ministry. And so we have now Priscilla and Aquila continuing on sort of what I like to think of as a family tree of ministry, where they are raising up somebody else. Somebody else already has gifts from God, already believes in God, and in fact believes in Jesus as the Messiah and is proving it, but is missing some things. He needs some discipleship, so they disciple him and then affirm him and send him off to continue his ministry with the additional understanding that they've provided him. So we see this sort of continuation of the model, and it doesn't stop with Paul. And Paul raised up Priscilla and Aquila, and it doesn't stop with them because they are discipling others. And that's what we need to see. That is the model of Jesus, and that is the New Testament model that Paul used. And it not only disciples people in their faith, but it also is the model for raising up leaders, which unfortunately in the church, if we're not doing discipleship, then that's the reason we don't ever have enough leaders, is because discipleship is the first step. It's the beginning. Not everybody who we disciple becomes leaders, but if we're discipling as many as possible, many of them become leaders. And if we are short leaders, the chances are it's because we are not discipling. So let's stop trying to solve our leadership crisis, and let's start trying to solve our discipleship crisis. Why are people immature in their faith? Why are people continuing to fall back into sin and not being stable in their faith? Why are we short of leaders in the church? Why are we? The answer to all of those questions is discipleship. That if we would just follow the model of Jesus, which was followed by Paul and the New Testament apostles, um, then the problems that we have in the church would be overcome. So let's get back to the basics. That's what this study is about.